Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will attempt to explain and offer solutions to the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 9. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues affects how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 9, the top 3 issues are the semantics of the verbs in verse 4, the grammar and meaning of verse 7, and the meaning of verse 21, which talks about a fearful thing, or perhaps a teacher. The first issue is about the verbs in verse 4. As you can see from our translation, we've understood the verbs as present tense. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish because of your presence. The ESV and a number of other translations also translate the verbs as present tense. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. The NLT, however, translates the verbs in this verse as past tense. My enemies retreated, they staggered and died when you appeared. Still others translate the verbs as future tense. The LEB, for example, along with some of the ancient translations, says, when my enemies turn back, they will stumble and perish because of your presence. The Hebrew text of Psalm 9:4 reads, Bashu voivai achor, yikashlu v'yovdu mipanecha. There are 3 verbs in this verse. The first verb, bashuv, is an infinitive construct and has no tense in and of itself, when my enemies turn. The next verb in verse 4b is a yiktul, yikashlu. And the last verb, also in verse 4b, is a v'yiktul, v'yovdu, a yiktul with a simple vav prefix. The question is whether these 2 verbs, yikashlu v'yovdu, are to be interpreted as past, as in the NLT, present, as in the ESV, or future, as in the LEB. If past, then the psalmist would be celebrating something God did in the past. If present, then the psalmist would be celebrating something that God does time and time again. If future, then the psalmist would be anticipating God's action in the future. Reading the verbs as past tense, they stumbled and perished, is supported by the wider context. The first half of the psalm seems to be a celebration of what God has done in the past. In verse 2, the psalmist says that he will tell about the Lord's wonderful works. In verses 6 to 7, we read about events which are clearly past tense. You rebuked nations, you destroyed the wicked, the enemy came to an end and ruins forever. Reading the verbs in verse 4 as past tense is consistent with this context. The difficulty with the past tense interpretation is that yiktul verbs don't usually initiate past tense time. Now they can be used to refer to past events, but only when a past tense time reference has already been established. Up to this point in Psalm 9, no reference to the past has been clearly established, and so it's unlikely that the yiktul verb should be read as past tense. If the author wanted to clearly refer to the past, then he probably would have used katal verbs. The future tense interpretation is, by contrast, more likely in terms of verbal morphology. Yiktuls are often future tense. Yet the future interpretation is difficult in the context. While it becomes clear in the second half of the psalm that the psalmist is being troubled by enemies, whom he hopes will retreat, stumble, and perish, the first part of the psalm is focused on what God has done, not on what he will do in the future. In the immediately preceding section, verses 2 to 3, the psalmist commits to recounting God's wonderful acts, and then in the immediately following section, verses 6 to 7, the actions described are clearly past tense. So in the context, a future reading is unlikely. This leaves a present tense reading as the most likely for verse 4. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. That is, time and time again, you have defeated my enemies. Whenever they attempt to retreat in battle, they end up stumbling and perishing before you in total defeat. This view accounts for the use of yiktul, since yiktul is often used to describe events that take place habitually, time and time again. This view also accounts for the wider context of this section in the psalm, which is a recounting of the Lord's wonderful works. Now, all of the interpretations discussed so far treat verse 4 as a self-contained sentence, with a when clause in verse 4a and a then clause in verse 4b. When, or whenever, my enemies turn back, then they stumble and perish. Yet many commentators have argued that verse 4 is dependent on the previous clauses. I will praise the Lord, I will sing praise to your name when my enemies turn back, when they stumble and perish before you. According to this interpretation, verse 4 is still a when clause, but the then clause is no longer verse 4b. Instead, the then clause is verses 2 to 3, and verse 4b is a continuation of the when clause. So when my enemies turn back, when they stumble and perish, verse 4, then, verses 2 to 3, I will sing your praises. This interpretation has some support among the ancient versions, for example, Symmachus, the Syriac Peshitta, and Jerome's Latin translation from the Hebrew. This interpretation is also based on a well-attested feature of Hebrew grammar. Infinitive constructs governed by prepositions, like bashuv in verse 4a, are often continued by finite verbs. A good example can be seen in Ecclesiastes 12:4. When the sound of the grinding is low, bishval kol hatachna, and one rises up, v'yakum, at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low, v'yishachu. Here the infinitive construct bishval is continued by v'yiktul verbs, v'yakum, v'yishachu, and there are many other examples like this one. Yet in all of the examples of this phenomenon, the continuation of the infinitive is signaled by a vav conjunction. The Ecclesiastes passage, for example, uses v'yiktuls to continue the infinitive. In Psalm 9, however, the infinitive is followed by a yiktul without a vav, yikashlu. The absence of any vav makes it unlikely that the semantics of the infinitive are being continued. The clause in Psalm 9:4 is thus less like the Ecclesiastes passage and more like what we see in Psalm 27:2. When evil people came near me, bikrov alai mereim, to devour my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Hema chashlu v'nafalu. In conclusion, then, we interpret Psalm 9:4 as a self-contained sentence, a when clause, verse 4a, followed by a then clause, verse 4b, with habitual semantics. Whenever my enemies turn back, then they stumble and perish because of your presence. We give this interpretation a B rating. The second exegetical issue is the grammar and meaning of verse 7a. We have translated this line, the enemy came to an end in ruins forever. The KJV interprets the clause differently. O thou enemy, destructions are come to a perpetual end. So our translation has the enemy as the subject of the clause. In the KJV, enemy is a vocative, and the subject is destructions or ruins. According to the NIV, the clause reads, endless ruin has overtaken my enemies. Here, as in the KJV, the subject is ruins, and yet enemies here is interpreted as the object. The ESV, on the other hand, is similar to ours. It says, the enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. The enemy is read as the subject of the clause. The Hebrew text reads, Ha'oyev tamu chravot lanetzach. The main point at which these English translations disagree is the syntactic function of the noun phrase, the enemy, ha'oyev. Is it a vocative, as in the KJV? Is it the direct object, as in the NIV? Or is it the subject, as in the ESV? Most of the translations we consulted take ha'oyev as the subject. The difficulty with this view is that ha'oyev is singular, whereas the verb tamu is plural. This mismatch in number is what leads others to conclude that ha'oyev must be something other than the subject, either a vocative or perhaps the direct object. But it's possible for singular nouns to have plural verbs if the singular noun is a collective, referring to a group of something. For example, in 1 Kings 20:20, we read, Vayanusu Aram. Aram fled. Even though the name Aram is singular in form, it takes a plural verb because it's a collective. Aram consists of many people. The likelihood that ha'oyev is a collective is increased by the fact that the plural verb in Psalm 9:7, the verb tamu, often takes a collective singular as its subject. For example, Isaiah 16:4 says, Tamu romes min ha'aretz. Those who trample have ceased or have disappeared from the land. The verb tamu is plural because the subject romes, even though it's singular in form, is plural in meaning. It's a collective. The view that ha'oyev in Psalm 9:7 is a collective also explains why oyev is definite, ha'oyev. One function of the definite article is to indicate that a singular noun refers to an entire class of something, the so-called generic use of the article. Gesenius's grammar cites this noun in Psalm 9:7 as an example of this phenomenon. It's probable then that in Psalm 9:7, the enemy, though singular in form, is plural in meaning. It's a collective, an enemy nation which consists of many people, or perhaps an alliance of enemy nations which consists of multiple nations. And this explains why the verb is plural. There is therefore no problem with reading the enemy as the subject, as most translations have done. But if the enemy is the subject, it's still not clear how the noun ruins, chravot, functions in the clause. Because the verb tamu is intransitive, that is, because it does not take a direct object, ruins must be something other than the direct object. But what is it? The ASV translates this clause in two halves, as, the enemy are come to an end. They are desolate forever. This is how we might understand the text if we were to pause after the verb tamu. Ha'oyev tamu, chravot lanetzach. But the Masoretic accents divide the text differently. They group the verb tamu and the noun ruins closely together. Tamu chravot, which may suggest that ruins modifies the verb as an adverbial noun phrase. This is how the ESV understands the verse. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. This interpretation is supported by other passages that refer to nations becoming ruins, chravot. Jeremiah 25:9, for example, says, I will completely destroy Israel and the surrounding nations and make them an object of horror and scorn and an everlasting ruin. Ulechorvot olam. In conclusion, then, there's no issue with reading the enemy as the subject of the clause. The enemy came to an end in ruins forever. The enemy is probably positioned at the beginning of the clause in order to set up a contrast between the enemy in verse 7 and the Lord in verse 8. As for the enemy, they came to an end in ruins forever. But as for the Lord, he will reign forever. We give this interpretation a B rating. The third and final issue is the meaning of the word morah in verse 21. We've understood this word to mean a fearful thing, that is, something that causes fear. Most modern translations similarly interpret this word as relating to fear or terror. The NIV, for example, says, strike them with terror, Lord. Some of the oldest translations of Psalm 9, however, the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Peshitta, understood the word to mean teacher or lawgiver. Set a lawgiver over them, Lord. If these ancient versions are right, then the Hebrew word morah comes from the root yod resh he, the same root as the word Torah, and it would actually be pronounced moreh instead of morah. We see this word moreh, for example, in Isaiah 9:14. The elder and the one who is honored is the head, and a prophet, a teacher of lies, moreh sheker, is the tail. This interpretation of the word in Psalm 9:21 makes sense in the immediate context. The very next line says, let the nations know that they are human. Teaching and knowing go together. Both belong to the domain of education. The prayer for a teacher in the A line fits well with the prayer for the nations to obtain knowledge in the B line. But in the wider context of Psalm 9, this request is odd. The psalmist seems to be more interested in the defeat of enemy nations than in their education. In verse 18, he says that the wicked return to Sheol. In verse 20, he calls on the Lord to rise up in judgment so that the nations do not prevail. In support of these pleas, he recalls previous times when God destroyed enemy nations. It would seem out of place then for the psalmist to pray at the end of the psalm for a teacher for his enemies. It's more likely that the word means fear or terror or something fearful or something terrible. This is how the other ancient translations and most modern translations have understood the word. The vocalization or pronunciation of the word as morah in the Masoretic text means that the Masoretes and their predecessors also understood the word to mean terror or fear. The difficulty with this view is that the word in Psalm 9:21 ends with the letter he, morah, whereas the word for terror ends with the letter aleph, morah. Both sound the same, but they are spelled differently. The fact that morah, or moreh, however you pronounce it, in Psalm 9:21 ends with he may have been what led the Septuagint translators to understand the word to mean teacher. That is indeed the most natural reading of the consonants. But there are other times when a final he takes the place of what is usually a final aleph. For example, in Psalm 60, verse 4, we find the form rapha, heal, with a final he instead of the usual rafa with a final aleph. And according to the Masoretes, this is exactly what's going on here in Psalm 9. The Masorah cites this as the only instance where the word morah, terror, is written with a final he instead of a final aleph. This interpretation also works well in the immediate context of verse 21 and the reference to knowing in the next line. According to Proverbs, it's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of knowledge. Here in Psalm 9, it's fear or something fearful that causes the nations to know that they are but mortals. This interpretation also works well in the wider context of the psalm. At the beginning of the psalm, in verse 2, David praises the Lord for his wonderful works, or acts that inspire wonder. In Hebrew, this is niflaot. And this word is used especially to refer to the wonderful works that God did in Egypt when he defeated the Egyptians and redeemed his people. The word morah in the last verse of the psalm is also used to refer to what God did at the Exodus, for example in Deuteronomy 4:34. And in this sense, the word morah doesn't refer to fear or terror in the abstract, but to something that inspires fear or terror, a fearful thing. So the psalm begins, verse 2, by praising the Lord for the wondrous works he's done in the past, and it ends, verse 21, with a prayer for him to do another wondrous work in the present, something that will strike the enemy nations with fear. As we've already begun to see, each of these exegetical issues affects the meaning of the psalm as a whole. The psalm opens by praising the Lord for the wonderful works he's done in the past. Verse 4 says that, without fail, whenever my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish from before you. In verse 7, the psalmist remembers how in the past the enemy came to an end in ruins forever. By contrast, he says in verse 8 that the Lord reigns forever. By the end of the psalm, it's become clear that the psalmist is dealing with a crisis in the present. And so on the basis of what God has done in the past, he calls on God to rise up and judge his enemies. And in verse 21, he prays that just as the Lord did awe-inspiring acts in the past, so he would do an awe-inspiring act in the present, so that the nations would know that the Lord alone is God, and that they are but humans. This has been the top 3 exegetical issues for Psalm 9. Thanks for watching.